So let's get started. The first one was, what's the permit all about? So we talked about in the first section, why do we have the permit? Why is it here? You know, Clean Water Act and all that stuff. And, you know, why is it in California? Because the Clean Water Act allows states to start their own program. And so now it's a state issued permit with federal backing, and who's required to have it. So we talked about the SIC codes and why they have permit coverage and all that stuff. And we talked about attachment A, where you can look in that. Now, this part we're going to talk about, okay, those who know you have general permit coverage. You know you're in the permit. You know you're required to have coverage. Let's talk about what the permit is requiring you to do. Okay. So here we are. It's the first pages of the permit. By the way, again, as we mentioned before, the general permit was revised or amended as of July 1st of this year. So the one that came in came in force July 1st of 2015. And then as of July 1st of this year, it had some significant amendments added to it. And we're not going to go into too much detail on a lot of the amendments because that would take more time than we have here for these slides. So we're just going to go over your requirements. What is this permit requiring of you? Section 1, or part 1 of this, we talked about Section 10 of the permit, where it talks about your stormwater pollution prevention plan. And now this one, we're going to concentrate on Section 11 of the plan, which is the monitoring, or what we call the MIP, the Monitoring Implementation Plan. Okay? So before we go any further, let's do a little bit of definitions, because I find that sometimes what a regulator says or what regulations say and what people hear are two different things. So discharge. Well, what's a discharge? Well, that's water or fluid that stormwater occurs when it flows off a facility or flows into a conveyance system, storm drains, well, that flows off site. So it's water leaving your property. So if it goes into a storm drain that leads off your property, that's a discharge. Okay. Point of discharge, or what many of us still call outfalls. Under the current permit, technically an outfall is discharge to the ocean directly. So they prefer us to use the term point of discharge, but a lot of us still use the term outfall. Outfall is the point at which your water leaves your property. So point of discharge, outfall, potato, same thing. Impoundment is your ability to hold on to or contain your water. That's a big one. We talked about LID in the first session, low impact development. We kind of touched on that lightly. And that's basically what they're talking here about, basically able to hold on your water. See if you can have it percolate or soak into the ground, or if it's permeable, then grab it and either use it or whatever else is evaporation, or you can use it for a process. So one of the things the permit requires you to do is first you have to do observations and inspections, and then you have to do sampling. Okay. So what observations you have to do? Well, there's two types of observations in this permit. You have to do monthly visual observations, which we refer to as dry weather inspections, and you have to do stormwater observations, okay? And the good thing about the stormwater observations are you only do them when you're grabbing samples. So if you don't grab a sample, there's no observations to perform because it's not a qualifying storm, and we'll talk about a qualifying storm. And then, so monitoring is made up of two things. You have the observations of the monthlies, and then the stormwater observations, and then you have your sampling, is where you grab a qualifying storm event. Okay, so let's talk about your monthly visual observations, okay? First of all, they need to be conducted a minimum of once per calendar month. So again, to reiterate from the previous part, your stormwater year is July 1st to June 30th, okay? So it's July 1st to June 30th. So it's a fiscal year. So some people think, oh, the stormwater year is January 1st. No, actually, January 1st is actually in the middle of your stormwater reporting year. It actually starts July 1st. So you need to, but the monthly inspections are in the calendar month. And so they're required to be done during daylight facility operating hours. And it's supposed to be done on a day without rain or precipitation. Okay. So for my good friends that are further up in the higher elevations, precipitation is the word we use because sometimes you have snow or you have other types of or sleet or things. But for the people in the valley here, like in Lodi, basically we have rain. So monthly inspections, that's why we refer to them as dry weather inspections. And it can be done during daylight business hours, and it has to be done on a day without precipitation or without rain. And you have to do them at least once a month. Now, what we recommend is you wait towards the end of the month, because if you do an inspection July 1st and then June 15th, you have a discharge of non-stormwater, then you have to go back and say, well, we have to go back and change that. So you want to wait until either a discharge happens during that month or at the end of the month when you do your final inspection. One thing to keep in mind also is you have to make sure that you're looking for two things in your monthly inspection. First of all, you're observing for non-stormwater discharges, okay, and their sources. So there's two types of non-stormwater. You have authorized and unauthorized, okay? In my full training, I kind of give you a listing of what's allowed. And my philosophy is kind of like when they train people at a bank to look at cash. They don't train them to find counterfeits by showing them every type of counterfeit. They show them this is what a real 10, this is what a real 20, this is what a real 50 or 100 looks like. And if it deviates from that, it's not real. So what you want to do is know what's allowed to leave. That way you'll know if it's not listed there, what's not allowed to leave. You're inspecting exposed areas of stormwater and reviewing the status of your BMPs. So you walk around once a month to look at your best management practice, your BMPs. We talked about that before. Things that you do or things that you build to reduce or eliminate pollutants in stormwater. So take a look at your BMPs. Okay, what do we got? Are they working? Are they okay? If we have, for example, say you use drain inserts. Well, I recommend this time of year you switch out all your inserts, put new stuff in. And two, do we have some sort of filtering socks? Okay, when's the last time we changed these filtering socks out? It's probably time we change them out again. Depending on your pollutant loading, maybe you don't have to change them out, but perhaps you do. So take a look at that, see them replaced, take a look at how we're doing our good housekeeping. Remember, you have the minimum required BMPs. We talked about the minimum, good housekeeping, preventative maintenance, all those things. Well, are we doing those? And if we're not, we need to do them. So, for example, a lot of people are worried when they do their monthly inspections. Oh, I don't want to write anything down because I'll write something down and get in trouble. No, actually, it's a good thing if you write something down, as long as you write down when you addressed it. Okay? Why? Because many times people will pencil whip, or where basically they'll just go in and just fill out the paperwork and say, hey, I did my inspection, whether they ever walked outside or not. Okay? Well, that's called pencil whipping. And if a regulator comes, especially if they look at your stormwater discharges and find that you have some exceedances, they're going to say, wait a minute, you have some exceedances for solids or whatever, but yet, according to your monthlies, everything was always pristine. You never had a problem. Well, that doesn't make sense. So it's actually better that when you do your inspection, if you do see something, for example, say a truck had a busted hose and there's hydraulic fluid on the floor, no big deal. I would write down, hydraulic fluid on the floor, and then I'd say immediately put absorbent on it and then swept up, quickly, and then all done by the end of the day. Okay. So as long as you document the resolution, what you're doing is you're telling them, hey, we're doing real inspections. We're actually doing real things. So they don't think you're pencil whipping. They actually see that you found the problem and you fixed it and you maintain compliance. If everything's always pristine and yet you have numbers that are off, they're going to say, okay, there's a disconnect here. The whole point of the monthlies is to make sure that your BMPs are set and ready to go. And if you do follow non-stormwater, that you find out what that source is and see where it's going, document the water leaving, and say whether it's authorized. If it's unauthorized, you need to stop it right away and then document what you did to keep it from happening. If it's authorized, they still want you to minimize it. They still want you to try to keep it from getting too much. For example, irrigation is a type of authorized non-stormwater discharge as long as you use pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers in conjunction with manufacturer specification. Okay, but if it's authorized, you still want to limit it. You still want to minimize it, and that's one of the. If you know characteristics that note that the general permit has conditions for authorized non-stormwater discharges. Okay, and those conditions, one of the big ones is try to limit the amount leaving. So even though it's authorized, they still don't want you to let water flow if you can avoid it. So if you have a busted sprinkler head and you have water shooting off, how many times you've driven down the road and see a sprinkler shooting water off into the sidewalk? They're doing a great job of watering the sidewalk, but they're missing the grass. Or if you find that some things are being overwatered to where water's leaving, then you want to address authorized non-stormwater discharge, a little excessive, adjusted whatever later, just document what you did to fix it. That's all. You maintain compliance. And if you see water leaving your property and you don't know where it's coming from, you need to try to find out, because if it's unauthorized, you're required to stop it right away. I had a client where they had these giant pumps where they'd pull fuel out of piping and run them using Kinder Morgan pumps into their facility. And the Kinder Morgan pumps had the motors had these cooling fins, and they ran tap water through the cooling fins to cool off the motor. The water never came into contact with the fuels or oils or that they were pumping through the pipeline. But they would run tap water through these cooling fins, and then like a radiator from a car, and then they just drop it down the storm drain. Well, because they use that water in a process, it's no longer authorized. It was considered processed water, and it's unauthorized. So when I brought it to their attention, Kinder Morgan had heard this before, so they knew what to do. So basically what they came and they put a cooling unit on their motor, and so that way their motors would maintain coolness. And they cut off the flow of the tap water, and they stopped. And so they basically said, stop. They basically documented, tap water is no longer being used to cool motor by this date and this time. They maintain compliance. They didn't leave compliance. They maintained compliance. So you want to inspect outdoor areas for equipment, storage areas, outdoor industrial activity areas, BMPs, any other potential source of pollutants. Also, harkening back to the previous slide, just real quick, you want to look at, when you're walking around your site, say you don't see water flowing off at the time or something flowing off, but you see staining leaving your property, okay? You need to try to figure out what that is and where it's coming from, because you need to be able to stop it or account for it, okay? Just want to let you know. So now let's talk about, so that's monthly. So to recap the monthly, one has to be done once a month during the calendar month, July, August, September, so forth and so on, once a month. Has to be done during your daylight hours. So if you're open 24/7 like some facilities, you can't do your monthlies at night because it's nighttime. It has to be during daylight operating hours, okay? And it has to be done on a day without precipitation, because how are you supposed to know what non-stormwater is leaving if it's raining? It's commingling. So they want you to do it on a day without rain so you can determine if you do see water leaving, that it's not just leftover stormwater runoff. So now let's talk about sample event observations. It needs to be conducted at the drainage location during sampling. So some people, if they're blessed, have only one outfall, some are placed a point of discharge. Other people have multiple outfalls or points of discharge. Wherever you grab a sample, simultaneously, you're supposed to require to do your observations. Now, here's one of the differences between the monthly inspections and sampling inspections. You can grab samples in the middle of the night. If you're a 24/7 facility and discharge starts in the middle of the night, you're required to grab a sample, and we'll talk about your requirements for that. So you can't do your observations during the daytime because your discharge happens at night. So unlike the monthly inspections where you're required to do those during the daylight business hours, sample observations can be done at night if that's when your discharge occurs. Make sure that you follow up, that you have all the necessary information. The permit outlines the information you're supposed to have. WGR has created some forms that we use when we do inspections or things for people, when we grab samples for people, which we're pulling away from that because it's hard for us to get to places, in a timely manner. But when we were doing a lot more of the sampling, we actually created forms. So if somebody wants to have some of those forms we created that have all the permit requirements, let me know. I'll be more than happy to forward them to you after this is over. You want to make sure that your inspections include all the required information for necessary follow-up. So that means make sure your forms everything the permit requires. Okay. Qualifying storm event. Okay, here's where we're getting to the weeds. Okay, what is a qualifying storm event? Not every storm that comes by is qualified for you to get a compliance sample. You're like, what? Why? Because they want to get something that's representative of your flow. They want to get something. So first of all, the storm has to cause a discharge, water leaving your property or going to a drain that leaves your property. And it has to have enough flow for you to go grab a sample. They don't define flow too much. In the 1992 guidance document, they talk about for areas that are completely paved, that are permeable, as a rule, by the time you get 1/10 of an inch, you have enough rain for a flow. And we've actually found that to be fairly consistent, that for facilities that are completely paved or permeable, and water, and you hit a 1/10 of an inch, you have enough flow to grab a sample. Okay. But that's not always the case. That's why you'll see in this permit, they don't actually have a number. You're like a 1/2 an inch or 1/10 of an inch, that's considered qualified. Because every facility is different. I have some facilities where it takes a 1/2 an inch before they can get flow because their facility soaks in water. I have clients where they have ponds where the pond fills up, and until the water actually leaves the property, it's not a discharge. So it has to be a discharge. I have some clients, I used to have clients in Southern California where they have a big pond, and all the water would go to their pond, and then a day or two later, when they had time, they'd go out there, open up a valve, let the water go, and grab a sample. Well, that was a qualified discharge, even though it was bright and sunny outside and the birds are singing and everything's great and they're wearing sunglasses. Bottom line is, water didn't leave their property until they opened that valve and it left. When that stormwater left, that was the point at which their qualified storm event began to happen. So a QSE, a qualified storm event, is where you have enough flow where it causes a discharge. Now, many of my clients don't have the option of ponds and stuff. So basically, when it rains enough that you have enough flow to where you can actually reach in there and grab a sample without scraping or gouging or anything like that, that's a flow. So if it rains and the water kind of grabs the side of the drain and kind of hugs and goes down the side of the drain, I would not consider that a qualifying discharge. You don't have enough flow to be able to grab a sample. If you have to gouge or scrape, that's not a flow. It has to be enough flow for you to fill up a sample bottle. Also, a qualifying discharge has to be preceded by 40 hours with no discharge from any drainage area. So this is per drainage area. So in other words, if you have more than one outfall, you can have a qualifying storm from one outfall and not necessarily from another. I have a lot of clients where they have 2 outfalls. One outfall, it takes a 1/2 an inch to an inch of rain before it flows. Another outfall, it rains and water goes right away. So it really depends on the outfall. But it has to have 40 hours before without a discharge. So a qualified storm has to have enough flow to grab a sample. It has to be a rainstorm or water where it's flowing to where you can grab a sample. And 2, you've had to have 40 hours before without a discharge. Okay? So that's the 2 caveats. That's what a qualifying storm is. It's actually pretty simple. 2 things. 1, flow, and 2 days before, 40 hours before without a discharge. Okay? And something to keep in mind, you only need to sample if there is a discharge. If there's no discharge, you do not sample. Okay? Many times, years ago when I first started with WGR, my supervisor, John, had gone to a client where they had a pond. They were a recycler. And they were grabbing samples, and they were really high in numbers. Their metals and solids were through the roof. And so he went to go help them out. And he walked in, he goes, okay, well, where's your outfall? They said, well, what do you mean outfall? He goes, yeah, where does water leave your property? They said, well, it doesn't leave our property. It goes to a pond. And he's like, well, where's your discharge? He said, it doesn't leave. So they misunderstood. This is the Industrial General Stormwater Permit is a surface waters permit. So it's water going to the surface waters of the United States. If it doesn't leave your property via discharge, it's not a sampling to grab. So he basically helped them make sure their water went to the pond and was relatively clean, because you don't want to contaminate the groundwater. That's a whole other set of regulations you don't want to deal with. So the water, they put some things in place to make sure their pond was filled up with relatively clean water when I was helping them. But he basically helped them to realize until your water actually fills up properly, you're not grabbing a sample. So unless the storm generates a discharge, do not grab a sample. Collecting samples, okay? You're required to collect a sample from a qualifying storm event, okay? When do you collect the samples? Okay, you're required to collect, it has to be 4 hours from the start of discharge during facility scheduled operating hours. So if the rain starts and you have flow, so people think, okay, wait a minute, it starts raining. Not only does you have to have rain start, you have to have it start and have enough for there to be flow. So when rain starts and you have flow, that starts the QSC right then, your qualifying storm event. Okay, great. We have enough rain, we have flow. Okay, and so once discharge starts during your business hours, say if you're open Monday through Friday, 7 to 4, and between 7 and 4, rain starts, and then by 11 o'clock, whatever, you have flow. That's when the QSC starts. So you have 4 hours from the start of discharge to grab that sample. Or if it rained the night before and you're pretty sure you had a discharge, and you come in the next day and there's flow, you're allowed to grab a sample up to 4 hours from the start of business, as long as your initial discharge happened within a 12-hour period. So what does that mean? So for example, say you're open Monday through Friday, 7 to 4. Okay. The night before, around midnight, you know it rain picked up, and you based on your knowledge of your facility, you figure somewhere around midnight or so, water flowed off property. Okay. Well, if that's the case, then you know that, okay, fine, we know we had discharge around midnight or so. You come in the next morning at 7 o'clock and the rain picks up and there's flow. If you know you have discharge and you know you're within 12 hours of the discharge the night before, so you have till noon the next day, and then you come in at 7 and there's flow, you have up to 11 o'clock to grab that sample, 8, 9, 10, 11. So to recap, 1, if discharge happens and it's qualifying because you didn't have 48 hours before of discharge, during the daylight business hours, during your regular business hours, you have up to 4 hours to grab that sample. Or if discharge happened outside your business hours before and you come the next day and it's within 12 hours of that initial discharge, you can grab a sample up to 4 hours from the start of business. Okay? If you have any questions, when we're done with this training, feel free to come back on the questions period and we'll go ahead and recap this again. This is of everything here, this is the most confusing, so people don't get the whole 12-hour rule. So to recap, the 12-hour rule, as I call it, is if it rains the night before, if it rains outside your business hours and you come in and it's within 12 hours from that initial discharge that started outside your business hours, then if you have flow, you can grab a sample. So for example, some people say, okay, well, I came in at 7 o'clock. I know it rained last night at midnight, and I know we have flow. I came in at 7 o'clock, but there was no discharge. But then the storm came in, and by 10 o'clock, we had flow. Well, as long as it's within 4 hours to start discharge, you can grab that sample. Okay? Same thing with the 4 hours. If it starts through the daytime, if daytime, say you're working on something blows up or there's a problem, and you can't pull away to grab a sample, and the rain starts and there's flow, and the rain stops, and then an hour later it picks up again and you have flow again. As long as it's within that 4 hours, you can grab that sample. Okay, so there's a little more wiggle room into this current permit than there was under the 97 permit. So you're not required to grab samples during dangerous conditions. So some people are like, well, it's rain outside, but there's fork lightning or there's flooding and there's trees coming down. And no, you're not required to grab samples during dangerous conditions. And so if there's something going on and you feel in good faith it's not safe, then you're not required to grab a sample. Now, the permit does say you're allowed to grab samples outside your scheduled business hours, but it's not required. And I recommend that you not do that, only because you don't want to set a precedence. If you're not there, you don't want to come in on a Saturday if you're not there on the weekends or on a holiday or something like that if you're not there. I recommend sticking to your business hours for grabbing your samples. Stick to the rules. So now the question is, okay, so now I know that I have to grab samples. Now I know I have to grab samples when there was a qualified storm. And a qualified storm, again, is it has to have enough flow and it has to have 48 hours before without a discharge from each outfall. Okay? So again, if there's an outfall that didn't discharge before but discharges now, if it's been 48 hours per outfall, you can grab a sample from that outfall. Okay? So qualifying storm, flow, and 48 hours without a discharge prior. 2, I can grab samples within 4 hours of start discharge, or if it started the night before, as long as it's within 12 hours, and I can grab up to 4 hours from the start of business. Okay, so now we have that. Now we're going to ask, well, how many samples do I need to collect? Well, if you're a standard industrial discharger, you have to grab 2 samples during the first half of the reporting year, which remember is between July and December. We told you it starts in July 1st. So between July through December, that's the first half of the year. If you have a qualifying discharge, and we'll talk about that, you need to grab a sample. Now, the old permit, the 97 permit, used to say you're supposed to grab the first qualifying storm of the season and then a second storm. That language was not in this permit. It says you need to grab 2 storms during the first half of the year. So if you get 2 storms, but you say, well, I'm not going to grab the first one, I'll grab the next one. Well, you're gambling because you may not get 2 qualifying storms. I mean, we've seen in the past couple of years, getting 2 qualifying storms between October, especially, and December can be dicey. Most of our rain seems to be coming in between January and March. So if you have a qualifying storm that occurs between July and through December, I would grab it because you're never guaranteed a second qualifying storm. Okay. If you're part of a compliance group, you're required to grab one sample during the first half of the year between July and December through December, and one sample during the second half of the year between January and June. So to recap, if you're a discharger, not part of a compliance group, you have to grab 2 the first half of the year between July and December through December, and you're supposed to grab 2 between January and June, or grab, if you're part of a compliance group, 1 between July through December and 1 between January and June, if they occur. Okay, so qualifying, it has to be a qualifying storm. According to the General Permit Fact Sheet, Section 2J1, if 4 qualifying storm events do not occur during the stormwater monitoring year, a discharger is not required to make up the sampling events in subsequent reporting years. So the fact sheet is a document. It's not a regulatory document. However, it comments on your document. So in some senses, it's kind of a, well, it's not actually regulatory. It is sort of a de facto. It explains, or it helps, let's just say it supports the permit. It explains the reasoning or the rationale behind the permit, okay? And the fact sheet outlines that basically if you didn't have 2 QSC, especially is very common here in California, especially at least this part of California, Northern California here, that you maybe will get 1 qualifying storm event the first half of the year, but it's where you actually get 2. So you're not required to make that up either the second half of the year or following years. In other words, you don't say, I only got 1 qualifying storm this first half of the year, so now I have to get 3 between January and June. Not necessarily. Not unless you, now if you made a mistake and you could have grabbed the qualifying storm and you didn't, then you might consider doing that. However, if you only had 1 qualifying storm event and 1 discharge, then you're not obligated to go try to make it up later because you only had 1 qualifying discharge. You're only required to grab qualifying storm events. So what the fact sheet is saying, listen, if you didn't get all 4, it's okay if you didn't have a qualified storm event. Now, if you did, you have to explain your annual report why it is you sat on your hands and didn't grab your sample, okay? But if you didn't have a qualifying storm event, don't feel obligated to go back and make up for it, okay? But if you did and you blew it and you didn't grab it when you probably should have, then you might consider trying to capture more if you can. Under the general permit, there are 3 sampling constituents that all facilities must analyze for in stormwater discharges. Okay, so now we talked about we talked about the fact that you have to sample. You have to talk about your type of monitoring, your monthly and your stormwater monitoring. You talked about qualifying storm events and when you're supposed to grab a sample, the 4 hours after start, all that. Okay, now we're going to talk about what it is you're supposed to sample for. Okay, first of all, I call it the 3 basics. Everybody, if they discharge and are under the general permit, had to grab three basic sample constituents, okay? First of all, they have to do pH, okay? A numeric measurement of hydrogen ion concentration, the neutral range is usually somewhere between 6 and 9. That's the range they give you, with neutral being closer to 7, okay? Now, one of the things that the Clean Water Act says is basically if they put a standard on a federal level, states are required to meet that standard. So a state can make their permits more stringent than the federal, but they can't make it less stringent. Okay. So if, for example, a couple years ago for pH testing, the acidity of water or whether it's caustic or basic, they determined that the most accurate way is to grab a sample within 15 minutes of collecting your sample. So as of July 1st of 2015, it was required that everybody has to test for pH within 15 minutes of collecting your sample, which means most likely field testing. For most people, unless there's a lab right around the corner, they're not going to be able to get that pH requirement within 15 minutes of collecting your sample. So the permit allows you to use pH paper to do that. Just make sure that your pH paper has a range that it can detect things below up to 6 and to 9, or below 6 and above 9. Why? I had a client where they were grabbing samples and said, hey, look, our pH is at 9, and they worked a lot with cement. I'm like, great. Then I come and find out later, I looked at their pH paper. The pH paper only goes up to 9. Okay. Well, the range is between 6 and 9 pH units. So you need to have pH paper that tells you whether it's below 6 or whether it's above 9. So it has to be qualifying pH paper. Okay. It has to be pH paper where when you sample it, you test it, it can tell you accurately or fairly accurately if you're within the range. Okay. And you're supposed to do your test of your pH within 15 minutes of collecting your sample. So 1, pH. Now, by the way, and one quick note on pH, I much prefer using a pH meter where you calibrate it. They're more accurate, and they and when you calibrate them, and I would document the calibration of it. Most of them, all you have to do is calibrate the day you're going to use it, and it's good for the day. Most brands, that's the way it works. They're easy to use, and I trust them. I've had clients where they've used pH paper. They say, hey, we're having pHs of 4 and we're having pHs of 5. And so they got numeric action levels, NALs for pH. I said, wait a minute, it doesn't make any sense. And then I said, test your strips. So they test your strips in just tap water, and all the strips came out to below 4. And then I said, your strips are bad. So before you use your pH strips, make sure that they're good. What I would do is I'd test them with tap water, test 1 or 2 tap water to see if because tap water is usually around an 8 in pH as a rule, not always, but test it and see what is, or even better yet, if you can get a pH buffer, I would test it the buffer, so it should match that buffer range. So if you have a strip and you have a buffer of 4.0 and you dip it in there, your strip should say around 4.0. Okay, that's the ultimate, But my preference is to use a meter over paper because the papers have a tendency to go bad. And I would consider buying a new set every year, just that way your old set, I don't want them going bad on you. And you give false readings, you end up having to have NEL exceedances for something that wasn't an exceedance. So everybody has to look for 3 things: pH and total suspended solids. If you ever think of a snow globe where you shake it and you see all the little particles flying all over the place, that is solids, okay? The stuff that doesn't dissolve in water, okay? That stuff that sticks out. And so you have to sample for pH, the acidity or the basic nature of water. You have to settle for total suspended solids, okay? And you have to sample for oil and grease, okay? It used to be in the old permit, you could sample for oil and grease, or you could sample for total organic carbon. But under the permit as of 2015, they said, no, just oil and grease, which is, you can use method 1664A, which is recommended, or 1664B. Either one is acceptable by the water board. Okay, so what else do you have to sample for? Okay, so there's 3 basics, but here's where you really need to do an assessment of your facility, because you're not just required to do the 3 basics. It depends on your SIC code and other things which you're supposed to require for. So you're supposed to sample for the 3 basics, and also table 1 in the permit section 11. There's a table 1, and it lists SIC codes. We talked about in part 1 about your standard industrial classification codes, and in your SIC code, if it's listed in the category, and say, for example, 5093, which are recyclers, they have extra metals and things and COD they're required to sample for. Under the I believe COD, but I know different additional metals they're required to sample for in their sampling. So you have to sample for your 3 basics and anything extra listed in table 1. Now, the good news is this. Let's just say you have your SIC code requires you to sample, for example, I have a client who had to sample for iron, but they had no activities that generated iron. And so the water board, we called the water board, and they came out and inspected the facility and said, you're right. There's no iron working or industrial activity, so you're allowed to remove iron from your sampling regimen, and we got documented confirmation from the water board. So you're required to do 3 basics. You're required to sample all the table 1 requirements unless the water board says you don't have to sample for this table 1 item because it's not part of your industrial activity and we've confirmed it. But they have to come out and confirm it first, okay? So you have to grab 3 basics. You have to grab anything on table 1 unless you can get the water board to the regional board to say that it's not required. 3, you're supposed to sample for any potential pollutants that might be likely present. Okay, this is the one where you have to do your assessment, and this is where a QUISP, someone with my credentials, it can help. They look at all your industrial activities. Well, for example, we work with sugars a lot. Okay, well, sugar usually affects DO or dissolved oxygen. So you sample for DO or you sample for BOD or COD or something like that. You say, oh, well, we work with glycol. Well, you definitely you're gonna be sampling for BOD if you use glycol and it's outside and exposed. Yeah, well, we cut aluminum a lot over here. Okay, well then you need to sample. You need to add aluminum to your sampling regimen. Whatever industrial activity you have, if it could affect your stormwater, if the constituents could end up in your stormwater, you're required to add that to your sampling regimen. Now, the good thing about these is because you add them yourself, if it turns out that they're not in your water or they're in such low amounts to below the NELs and you show a consistent amount, I recommend at least 4 samples, but a consistent amount showing that these things are not in our stormwater, you can discontinue sampling for those, but you need to document that in your stormwater pollution prevention plan, okay? So you have to grab samples for 3 basics, you have to grab samples for table 1 stuff, and you have to grab samples for anything you know might be present in your stormwater. But the good thing about those is if you show and prove that they're not in your stormwater after a couple of samples, you can just sample for them as long as you put a justification in your SWEP binder, in your SWEP. 3, you're required to sample for TMDLs, total maximum daily loads. That's a whole other discussion, which unfortunately with this limited time frame we don't have to go into. But TMDLs that are listed in attachment E of your permit. In fact, that's one of the major changes as of July 1st has to do with attachment E, which perhaps one day we can do a workshop on attachment E and all that. It's a whole nother world. You're required, if you have any things in the 303 listed item in Clean Water Act Section 303D, it tells states or territories are supposed to do an assessment of their watersheds and determine if it's impaired for beneficial uses. And if they think there's an impairment for that watershed, in other words, solids or just too much iron, they put it on the 303 list. And then if you have any activities that might affect one of those 303 list items, you need to add that to your stormwater sampling. And again, the good thing about those is if you can show that, hey, they require nitrates and we work with this, but look, there's no nitrates in our stormwater, therefore we're not going to longer sample. Just like the ones you added in point number 2, in point number 4, if you need to sample for them if they may affect stormwater, but if they find that they're not affecting stormwater and you're good to go, you can discontinue sample them, but you got to prove it, okay? You got to grab your samples. I recommend at least 4 consecutive samples showing that, hey, you don't have to have 4, but for this, in this case, you have to have at least 4 showing that, hey, I recommend 4, that we don't have this constituent, it's not in our stormwater. So even though it's a potential pollutant that we've determined, and also it's a 303 listed item, it's no longer, we've proven that it's not a problem. You're supposed to add any ELGs. If your facility has ELGs, you can look at attachment F for that. All my clients who are airports know about ELGs because they affect you. If you're a mine or if you're a power plant or ELGs, if you're a landfill, you have ELGs. So there's a lot of ELGs that may be affected by your facility. If you're not sure how to find ELGs, you can always talk to a quiz. He can help you determine that. And that should really be in your SWEP. If you have a compliant SWEP, the ELG should be spelled out in your SWEP. If it's not, you need to revise your SWEP to make sure that you address it. And if you don't have ELGs, you should say that in your SWEP regardless. Say, okay, this is our SIC code. Here's what we do. And no, we don't have ELGs. But you still really need to address it whether you have them or not in your SWEP. Just kind of a bonus point there for you. Toxic chemicals, in other words, TRI reporting chemicals. So if you have any TRI reporting chemicals, again, you're required to sample for those in your stormwater. And again, just like the point number 2, where you determine it's a potential pollutant, and point number 4, the 303 list items, if you find that your TRI reporting chemicals are not coming in your stormwater at all, that there's no evidence of it being there, or so to the point where it's not affecting your NELs, then you can discontinue sampling. But again, you have to prove it. Okay, and again, that's why I recommend at least 4 consecutive samples, at least. I mean, if you can, showing that, hey, look, we've had these samples and this is not an issue. But if you have TR reporting chemicals, you've got to put them in your sampling regimen, like the table 1s, and like any other pollutants, like section 2, like point 2. And then if you can show that your TR reporting chemical is not affecting your stormwater, eventually you can discontinue sampling for it. But again, this has to be spelled out in your SWEP. So we're making good time. Again, I took a lot of time in a short period of time. So we have plenty of time left for questions. We have 20 minutes left in the session. So I entertain any questions. Danny, do we have any chat questions?
No questions as of yet.
Perfect. So I want to go back to grabbing some of the, most people I get questions on is this section here. That's why I'm coming back to it. I want to kind of run over this again because a lot of people ask me, I don't understand. When am I supposed to grab samples? So let's just kind of walk over this again because this is the most confusing part and people kind of scratch their heads on this. One, you have to have a qualifying storm event. And remember, a qualifying storm event is a storm event that has a discharge, enough flow to grab a sample, and you have 48 hours before it without a discharge from that outfall. So again, you can have different outfalls, different places where water leaves your property, points of discharge. And if one outfall, you had a qualifying storm event, but then not later, you can grab a sample from another one if it generates later. So it's based on each outfall, individual outfall, not just the facility as a whole. So if you have an outfall or one outfall or several where they don't have any discharges for 48 hours, you can grab a sample. It's qualifying. Two, once the discharge starts during your business hours, you have up to 4 hours from the start of discharge to grab a sample. Okay. And then the most complicated one is the 12-hour rule, where if it starts outside your business hours, and then you come in the next day and the start of business hours, you have flow, you can grab a sample up to 4 hours from the start of discharge. So again, this is the most complicated part. I'm going over this again because I've had a lot of people who hear this and they're like, what? So if you have any questions on that, I'll be glad to answer it again. The bottom line is, one, if you have flow, grab a sample. Now, one of the things we'll talk about in Section 3, we're going to talk about sampling in Session 3. But one of the things you want to do is you don't want to grab a sample within the first 5 minutes of discharge if you can. Now, no one can, especially if you have water where it just flows off site and leaves, because if you look around you, there are businesses all around you. We have, especially in Lodi, we have a lot of agriculture around us, and many times those farmers are turning up their fields, and there's tons of plumes of dust that goes in the air. It lands on your property. So you have a lot of other people's activities ending up on your property. I have a client where they have hits for nitrates, but they don't do any nitrates in the facility at all. They had no nitrates. They don't do nitrates, but yet they had nitrates come up on their stormwater. And so we had to prove that, hey, it's not coming from them. In fact, we had a client out of the Port of Stockton where we did swipe testing and we proved that the nitrates issues they were having was coming from another facility that they were downwind from. We did swipe testing, we did air deposition testing. We showed also they had run-on to their property. We showed that the run-on had nitrates, elevated nitrates in it. So we proved that, hey, it's not them, it's from off-site. So many times you'll find that air deposition adds to your samples. See, these sample results are very, very low. For example, iron, it's 1 milligram per liter, 1 part per million. So that's a very low requirement. So if you grab samples, it's amazing that you can find that there could be more than one. You could be above 1 part per million. You're like, wait a minute, we didn't do anything with this. Why is it so high? For example, another constituent that's extremely low is copper. The numeric action level for copper, and we're not even talking about TMDLs, which is a whole nother kettle of fish. But the regular numeric action level for copper is 0.0332. So that's very, very low parts per million. So, I mean, you can get that from cars driving down the street and hitting the brakes because there's copper and brake lining. So you want to make sure that if you that when you grab samples, you don't want to grab samples right away. You want to take your time, let the water flow for a little bit if you can. Now, if rain stops and flow stops, you need to grab a sample before you lose your flow. So you need to be wise on how you grab your samples. But just realize that when samples first start, a lot of that water leaving your property isn't your stuff. It's in that water. It's everybody else's around you. So in part 3, we're going to talk about sampling, about smart sampling, about tips on sampling. And one of the things that we talk about, the tip is, hey, don't grab samples right away. If you can, again, it depends. If you can, wait a little bit and then grab a sample if you can. Okay. And again, within the 4 hours of discharge, if discharge starts and you go out to grab a sample and it stops, but then an hour or two later it starts again, as long as you're within that 4 hours, you can grab that sample. Okay. So some people say, man, I went to grab my sample, but the discharge stopped. It rained for 20 minutes. I got flow. I ran out here with my kit. I'm ready to grab a sample and I'm out. Darn, I missed my chance. Yes and no. Just wait, be patient. If rain starts up again within a few minutes, you can grab a sample. Again, it's sometimes, and you could make an argument that, hey, if rain started and stopped within 10 minutes, you didn't have a chance to grab a sample. It's not physically possible. I've had some clients, and it's a feasible argument. But again, at the same time, you don't want to sit in your hands. You say, I got 4 hours to grab a sample. And then you just, by the time you get out there, and it's too late, you had a chance to grab a sample and you missed it. So then you have to explain your annual report why it is you missed it. But not only that, you're going to have to put steps into your SWEP saying, okay, we missed the sample, but here's what we plan to do to try to keep from that happening again. The whole point of the SWEP is they want you to think through your program, and they want you to take steps to mitigate problems. So during your monthly inspections, when you're doing your monthly inspections, again, like I mentioned before, if you write something down, it's okay. Just make sure you take time to document the resolution to it. So what you're doing is you're actually proving your compliance. If they go through and they see that you wrote something down, then wrote something down, it was fixed in this day. This was on the ground, swept up by end of day, or whatever. If they see that you actually did a real inspection, it actually proves you're doing, because remember, the inspections are a BMP in themselves. Remember, it's anything you do or anything you build to reduce or eliminate pollutants in stormwater. That's what a BMP is. So if you're grabbing samples or if you're doing inspections, they are considered a BMP in and of themselves, because you're looking for problems and trying to fix it. And if you find a problem, you're not being punished if you find a problem and you fix it. Now, when it comes to NELs, which is a whole nother discussion, that's different. And I'm not exactly, I have a disagreement on that, but it's not my place. Let's just say that when it comes to NELs, if you go over NEL, you're automatically in violation of the permit. So that's where find a problem and fix it doesn't apply. But numeric action levels based on TMDLs and TNELs, which we can discuss in some other time, or I'll be happy to go over it with you sometime. Maybe we can do another workshop on that. Those is part of that iterative process I mentioned in part 1. The Yale permit in 97 said you had what you call a step-by-step iterative process, where you try something and it's just cost-effective, and you grab samples, and based on your samples, you have NAL exceedances. Okay, then you have to add more. There is a principle in the permit called the BAT-BCT principle. Well, what's that? BAT is best available technology, economically achievable. BCT is best conventional control pollutant technologies. Okay, what does that mean? That means they expect you to basically whatever your fellow businesses are doing, you need to do that too. So if you have the same type of business as somebody else, and they're not having any exceedances and you are, they're going to say, okay, what are you not doing? What are they doing? And you need to do at least what they're doing or better. And so that's why it's a moving target. Best available technology, economically achievable, BAT, they're always looking to build a better mousetrap, so to speak. They're always looking to, how can we improve this? How can we make this better? How can we make it more applicable? Used to be, they will never put a stamp saying this is BAT, BCT officially, because they're always trying to look for improvements, okay? So the whole concept of BAT, BCT is keep applying BMPs, technologies to your facility until you can get your stormwater to the acceptable water quality standards, okay? And that's what we're talking about there. So does anybody have any questions? Anything on the chat?
I actually had a quick question, Aaron. Could you maybe briefly explain, I guess as a facility, what the differences would be for, let's say you're at baseline to level 1 and to level 2, kind of what's the different requirements, that a facility would have to undertake if they ended up going into level 1 or level 2?
Those are good questions, and I'm glad we have enough time to address that. Okay, so the permit has things called NELs and TNELs, ALs, and then you have something called NELs. Okay, those are different. NEL is numeric action level, NEL. Okay, that means if you grab a sample and it goes over the NEL, I mentioned earlier iron. So you grab samples and you have iron is at 1.2 milligrams per liter. Okay, you're over the NEL. So does that mean you're in violation of the permit? No. However, at the end of the stormwater year, which is as of July 1st, you move from baseline status to level 1 for that parameter. Okay? So for example, say 1 year you have trouble with solids, and you go over the NAL for total spent solids is 100 milligrams per liter. So let's say at the end of the and you have two types of NALs. You have instantaneous, and you have annual. Okay, only three right now are instantaneous. You have pH, total spent solids, and oil and grease have instantaneous. In fact, pH is only instantaneous because it's a range. It's between 6 and 9 pH units. So it's instantaneous. If you get 2 pHs outside the range, you're at level 1 by the end of the year. Okay. However, the other ones, oil and grease and total spent solids, you have the instantaneous, which is 400 milligrams per liter for total spent solids, or 100 for the average. So say you grab samples and you average out below the 100 milligram per liter, then you maintain compliance. If you go over the 100 milligram per liter at the end of the year, you go to level 1 for total spent solids. Or if you grab two samples and they're both over 400 milligrams per liter, as of July 1st of the following storm year, you go to level 1 for solids because you had two instantaneous over. Okay, so when you have a parameter that goes over the NALs, so to be absolutely clear, you go to level 1 for that parameter. So for example, if one year you go over if you go over 1 for solids and the next year you go 1 for pH, you'll be at level 1. And then say the next year you go over solids again, you'll be at level 2 for solids, but you may be at level 1 for pH. So sometimes you have two different parameters with two different levels. So the first year, if you're over on a parameter, you go to level 1. And then the permit requires that you get trained by QUIST, someone with my credentials. And then you also have to have a QUIST help you do a level 1 technical report where they help you address the pollutants concern in the drainage area where it happened and the whole facility as a whole as well. And then see if you can come up with a way to bring those numbers down. And then let's just say you grab samples and your level 1 responses work and things go back down to baseline. After 4 consecutive samples below the NALs, if it averages up below the NALs, you can go back to baseline. Okay. Now, if you have a sample and you go over NAL, let's say again for solids, total cemented solids, and then the next year you go over again, you go from level 1 to level 2. Once you go to level 2 for total, for example, total suspended solids, you have to have a action plan. And again, you're required to have a QUISP, someone with my credentials, help you with that action plan. And what they do is you talk about, okay, you know what? We tried level 1 stuff. The iterative process, that step-by-step process. It didn't work, so we're adding additional stuff. We're doing different practices. We're doing whatever. Or we're putting a cover up, or we're putting something, whatever level 2 requirements. Now, you have to understand, when you get to level 2, you're expected to do more, okay? So if you're over, you need to put in BMPs that are more guaranteed to work. And eventually, if you keep going over, you're going to have to get a treatment BMP that is certified by a professional engineer, because you're not doing enough BAT, BCT. We talked about that. You're not doing enough if you don't step up and do a better quality BMP. Okay, so when you get to level 2, you have to say, okay, you know what? We need to put in some sort of advanced BMPs. We need to put something a little more than what we're doing. And then in your action plan, you say, okay, here's what we're planning to do. And then the permit gives you a choice of how you're going to approach this. Sometimes you can grab samples and you're over. And like I mentioned with that one client with nitrates that were over, we knew the nitrates were not coming from them. So the permit allows you to make a couple. You can do what they call a Bmp approach, and there's two sides to that. You can do them where you do your BMPs and say, we believe this is going to fix the problem, and it does. If you do the BMP response and it fixes the problem, you go back to baseline. But you could say, you know what? We're going to do the BMP response, but we don't think this is going to solve the problem. So so you do BMP response, and you still have the action levels over. Then you stay at level 2, or you stay at level 2. Now, so you have 2 there. You have A and B. One, you do BMPs and you say this is going to work, and it works. If it doesn't work, then you have to add more. Or you can say, hey, we do BMPs, but we don't expect it to work because this is all it's financially feasible for. Remember, to the extent feasible, this is all feasible for us to do given our abilities. And so we know we're going to go over, but this is the best we can do. Okay, so
hey, Aaron,
yes.
Real quick, we have a 5-minute warning here till we close out the session, but there is one more question towards the end that I'll ask you. We have from a participant.
Okay, then I'll just pause it real quick. So see why I didn't want to get into ERAs too much, because there's a whole lot to them. Okay, but 2, once you get to level 2, once you have an action plan, the following year you have a compulsory technical report where helped by QUISP. So the technical report says, okay, our action plan said this, and then here's the results of our action plan. Okay, so that's what those are. So basically, when your numbers go over, and by the way, you can find your requirements in table 2 of the permit. That's where you have your NEL exceedance, your NELs spelled out for you. Now, there's also things called TNELs, or they're NELs based on your receiving water, where your water quality is, and that's an attachment E right now. It doesn't affect the Central Valley that much. However, Southern California has a lot. The LA region, Santa Ana, some of those have TNELs that affect them, but they also have numeric effluent limits, and NELs, which is new as of July 1st. NELs are, if you go over an NEL, you're automatically considered in violation of the permit, and the permit says there's probably going to be a fine followed, and there's a whole another thing with that. But so you have 3 things. You have the NELs, which are standard. You have the TNELs, which are based on the TMDLs, and then you have NELs, which are numeric effluent limits, which are actual limits that if you go over those, you are actually in violation of the permit. The TNEL and the NEL, you're not in violation of the permit as long as you take steps to address them. The NEL, you are in violation of the permit, and you still have to address it. Okay, so what's the question we have?
Last question says, what are the sampling requirement changes from the July 1st, 2020 IGP update, if there are any?
Good question. That actually plays into what we're just talking about. As of July 1st, if you have any TMDLs that apply to your facility, you have the TMDL requirements, which are spelled out in attachment E. Also, if your watershed has NELs and it applies to your facility, you have to sample for those and show that they're not an issue. So, for example, if you have an NEL for iron, let's say, and you show that one of your potential pollutants is iron, you're going to have to make sure that you not only do you have a requirement for the NEL, but you have the requirement for the NEL. So that's really where the biggest change is. When you're grabbing samples now, the process of grabbing samples hasn't changed. It's still the whole 4-hour and 12-hour thing that hasn't changed. What has changed is what you're sampling for, and that or the requirements. One, not only are you looking for NELs now, but now you're looking for TNELs and also potentially NELs if the TNELs and NELs are going to be listed in attachment E of the permit. So if you don't have them listed in attachment E of the permit, then they don't apply to you. Like most of the Central Valley right now doesn't have anything apply to them yet, but they're coming. But the permit has a clause where they're allowed to amend it. So right now the Central Valley doesn't have any TNELs or TNALs or NELs that apply to them, but they will. It's coming. So I just want to let you know. Any other questions?
That was the only one so far.
So yeah, we went over kind of at the end here, kind of some deep weeds because of the permit. So just kind of with the 2 minutes we have left, the biggest changes that the permit had as of July 1st is 1, you have to make sure you're using sufficiently sensitive permit methods. 2, you have to make sure that you account for any TNELs, TNALs, and any NELs that might be present based on your receiving water. Okay, and also they have compliance options, which I really don't have a whole lot of time to get into, but the compliance options, you have two options. You can go with what they call an on-site option, where you capture your water, and as you can capture your water on site, and it has a whole list of requirements for that and monitoring requirements for that. But if you can grab your water on site, and you can be released from a lot of permit requirements, or if you can transfer your water to an offsite source, like where it gets treated offsite, and you can make an agreement with an offsite facility, you can be released from a lot of requirements of the permit. So a lot of people who have NELs, which are hard to reach, like for example, some of the NELs I saw in Southern California were for a copper was 0.0057. I mean, ridiculously low. There's no way anybody could ever, even if you never even work with copper, make those requirements. So if you're able to use one of the compliance options, which became effective as of July 1st, I would highly recommend that you do. So that's the main difference. So we've come to the end of our session. Our hour is up. Danny, are there any more questions?
Nope, that was it.
Well, thank you all for joining me for part 2 of the stormwater training. I appreciate you joining me. Again, I'm going to, sometime this week, hopefully by tomorrow, have these slides up on the website for you to be able to use. And also, again, like I said before, I have a certificate for you to have posted up on our website as well that you can use as proof of training. Thank you for joining me. Thank you for joining us for Stormwater Awareness Week. And I look forward to hopefully seeing you all soon. Take care now.